Last spring, when Catherine and I chose the theme of grounding for August, our thought behind that was that people would need a chance to center themselves in what nourishes them after the craziness of summer with travel to far off places, and to ground themselves before the demands of fall, before back to school, back to the church program year, back to more community meetings, back to whatever it is that pulls you in the normal course of a year. And back then we had no way of knowing that in mid-August our psyches would be reeling again, with a presidential bluster and threat of nuclear war, and with images of neo-Nazis marching through the streets of Charlottesville, waving signs and shouting words of anti-Semitism, words of hate against our black and brown siblings. So many of us felt shaken when we saw those images and read those news reports. We wondered, what century am I in again? What country am I standing in? And some of us, including your pastor, we have struggled. We struggled with how to respond. We Unitarian Universalists believe deeply to our core that our primary public response is a response of love with a capital L. But how do we do that when we feel so angry and so hurt and so scared ourselves? We wonder, is responding with love enough? Love once again, break our hearts open wide. As Charlottesville unfolded last week, there I was with my dear family in northern Arkansas. My heart often feels like it's pulled between two places. Those gently rolling hills of the Ozark foothills, and the green and humid heavy in the summer as they are. And here, stunning Southern California, brown and dry and hot in the summer. Those two places really couldn't be much different. The food is very different, I can assure you. The people are different. The landscape, so different. It feels like two separate worlds. I wonder when I land at the Little Rock Airport, do I need a passport to enter here? Last week with my family, my dad and I compared Arkansas and Los Angeles. He was trying to get me to say that I would move back home. I was like, keep dreaming. But he said, and I said, well, why don't you move to Los Angeles? Keep dreaming, he says. He's like, what? No way. There's too many people out there. And I was like, Dad, there's not enough people here. I feel both torn and held by these two cultures, these two places that claim space in my heart. And my guess is I'm not the only one in this room who feels torn and also held by multiple cultures or by different places. Last week it felt like the world as I knew it was crumbling again. I felt out of my usual element, and I searched for something to hang on to. The values that I hold dear, justice, equity, and compassion for all creation. Well, as much as I love Arkansas, I'll admit that those values can feel a little muted out in the hills. I don't always see those values reflected there. Not to say that they're not present, I just don't always see them reflected. And so I searched for a thread between my two worlds and a connection that I so desperately needed as I was trying to make sense of what was happening. This connection came in an unlikely form. It came in a flower. And not just any flower, a very specific flower. It's called a surprise lily. Have you heard of it? It's also called magic lily, or for those of you who are sassy in your speak, it is also called the naked lady. Ooh, yeah, and some of you know that one. Well, I fell in love with it, and it's a flower of many names because it's a flower with a split personality. Now, what do I mean by that? How do flowers have a split personality? Well, this particular flower, the leaves and then the flower stalk, they never appear together. The surprise lily is tricky. In the spring and summer, there's a mound of long green leaves that appear just almost out of nowhere in the garden. And so, if you're like me, you watch them eagerly, you water it, you wonder, when is a flower going to come up from this mound of green leaves? And then before you know it, in July, those leaves start turning brown and dying back, and you think, I am a terrible gardener because I've let this plant die before it was even allowed to bloom. I killed it. Oh, I feel terrible. That happens to me every summer. But then, about 6 weeks after the leaves have died and fallen away, 6 weeks and you have completely forgotten your angst over this little plant that you thought you had killed, out of nothing comes a long green stalk with a beautiful flower head on it of pink and white flowers that are shaped like a trumpet. They come out of nowhere, and these beautiful plants literally surprised me when they appeared in my home garden in August. I hadn't remembered about them, and I wasn't expecting them. And so while I was in Arkansas, I noticed surprise lilies are everywhere there. They're as ubiquitous there as agapanthus are out here. Those large purple globe flowers that you see everywhere that we have out bordering our parking lot here at Throop. Those lilies pop up along garden borders. They hug people's driveways. They surround fields with abandoned houses. They're just everywhere. And so there, in a place where Confederate flags hang side by side with the United States flag, during a time in the world marked by chaos and fear and hatred, there was this living symbol that provided connection to me here. A living symbol that brought calm to my mind, and when I saw them, it helped me listen for messages of hope and peace and love. Love once again, break our hearts open wide. Love once again, break our hearts open wide. But let's face it, as pretty as it is, a flower, it's not enough to sustain a soul in times such as these. The images we've seen this past week, white men marching with torches in the streets of Charlottesville, carrying Nazi and Confederate flags. The words we've heard hurled at Jews, at people with black and brown skin, phrases like Jews will not replace us, one people, one nation, end immigration, go back to Africa. Many of those chants I won't say from the pulpit because of language and content. But the fact is, it's just not what we're used to seeing. It's not what we're used to hearing. It's not what we expect to encounter in these United States of America. Now, we know that there's violence in the world. We're not naive. We know that there's hatred and fear of difference. We know that anti-Semitism exists. We know that racism and xenophobia exist. But for a large group of predominantly white men to march through a university campus carrying Nazi and Confederate flags, brazenly shouting hateful language, that is not normal. And it's not okay. And it is part of our moral duty and religious obligation to speak out, though how we do so will be unique to each and every one of us. And I know that speaking out can be hard, and it's scary. And depending on your social location, it can make us feel and puts us in a very vulnerable position. As we each find our own ways to teach and preach love in the face of extreme hatred, I ask you to consider this question. What grounds you in love so that you don't become as hateful as the ones we are trying to call back to a sense of shared humanity? What grounds you in love? And I ask you that question because it's a question that I'm continually asking myself. A couple of weeks ago, we explored the universalist grounding in a love that is big and wide and all-encompassing. Universalism teaches that all are saved, that there is a love wide enough to embrace us all, to embrace every part of us, to embrace every part of you. But how does that love move from inside of our hearts, from an inner compassion for creation, for humanity? How does it move from here out into the world, transforming institutions and social structures that breed hate and inequality? Love once again, break our hearts open wide. Love once again, break our hearts open wide. Love once again, break our hearts open wide. That question, how to move love from inside of our hearts out into the world, transforming institutions and social structures that breed hate and inequality, well, that is not a question that is new for us today. It's a question that has long troubled liberal religious people. Sometimes we find a symbol that does indeed connect us to something deeper, like my surprise lily. But we don't go any further than the symbol itself. We may talk about the beauty of that flower, but not the values or religious impulse that lies underneath it for us. James Luther Adams, 20th century Unitarian theologian and minister, he too struggled with this question in his own life. And he struggled to listen for what he called the costing commitment in liberal theology. And by costing commitment, he meant a religion that offers personal spiritual nourishment, but that doesn't end there. A costing commitment goes beyond that. It seeks a spiritual life for you, yes, and tending to one's spirit, though, for the sake of something larger, strengthening authentic, beloved community. Adams began to hear and understand this need for a costing commitment in liberal religion through his own direct experience with fascism and Nazism in Germany in the 20s and 30s. While he was in Nuremberg in 1927, he was there on a day when thousands of people had flooded into the city, thousands of people, young and old, and they were marching in a huge Nazi festival. They were singing and shouting. There were brass bands playing. It was quite the scene. And so as Adam stood in this throng of folks and watched what was happening in front of him, he turned and he started talking to the people next to him. And Adams, in a moment of boldness, he turned to a neighbor and he asked, "What's the meaning of the swastika that I see everywhere?" Now, of course, Adams knew exactly what that symbol was, but he was curious about how people would respond. Well, within a few minutes, as you may imagine, the conversation started so innocently, became quite escalated in its intensity. And Adams remembers that within a few minutes, I found myself in this heated conversation with more and more people joining in, particularly when the question turned to the Jewish question. As I bore down in the argument against these defenders of Nazism, asking more and more insistent questions, I was suddenly seized by the elbows from behind me and pulled vehemently out of the crowd. No one made an effort to help me. I immediately thought, I'm being taken into custody. I couldn't see who it was, and after extricating me from the crowd, this person marched me vigorously down an empty alleyway. On reaching the dead end of the alley, my host, a young German working man in his 30s, he wheeled me around and he shouted at me, "Don't you know that when you watch a parade in Germany today, you either keep your mouth shut or get your head bashed in?" My palpitation, he says, it mounted even higher at this moment, and I was all the more puzzled when my captor smiled and said, "Don't be frightened. I've saved you." Saved me from what? From being sandbagged. In about 5 more minutes of that argument at the curb, they would have knocked you out flat on the pavement. As you can imagine, an incident of that intensity greatly impacted Adams and his beliefs about religion and his beliefs about his own purpose in the world. In the days to come, as he reflected on this incident, he asked himself this question: if fascism should arise in the States, what in your past performance would constitute a pattern or framework of resistance? He asked himself that, and then he actually thought about it for several days. And as he considered his own past actions, the life he had led up until then, regretfully, he says, his own answer lacked power and purpose. He thought about the mornings of waking up, reading the newspaper, the days he would go to the voting booth, the sermons he preached on the Depression or in defense of strikers. Sometimes he would protest against censorship in Boston. But when he got really honest with himself, he admitted that he had no adequate conception of what real engaged citizen participation, the kind that bends the arc of the universe toward justice, he really didn't know what that looked like. He writes that after the war, he repeatedly heard anti-Nazis say, if only 1,000 of us in the late 20s had combined in heroic resistance, we could have stopped Hitler. Love once again break our hearts open wide. 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 Unfortunately, Our reality since last November demands that we ask ourselves almost the very same question that Adams asked of himself in the 1930s. When fascism tries to take hold in the States, what in your past performance would constitute a pattern or framework of resistance? Though you may not find your own self knee deep in a Nazi parade and fear of being hauled into authorities like Adams did, or as some of our UU siblings did last week and yesterday and will this afternoon in actions of love and witness, I know that the reality is each and every one of you comes face to face with hatred or injustice in this world. For some of you, it's at a relatively safe distance. But for others of you, because of your skin color or your gender or a host of other identities, you see it more up close and personal. Unitarian Universalism teaches us to stand on the side of love. And a gift of our liberal religion is that in turn we ask the question, is responding with love enough? Is that enough for the task at hand in these days? Some of you have asked that very question this week, either on Facebook or to me personally. And my answer is yes, it is. And that's the good answer. And no, it's not. An answer with a split personality, a bit like that flower that so captured my heart while I was in Arkansas. So yes, a feeling of personal deep compassion is absolutely necessary. And so some mornings I invite you to turn your meditation or your prayer practice toward a loving peace for this world. All you need to do as you get grounded is send out a feeling of love and harmony to this planet, to all creation. Yes, go out after worship and treat people with kindness and care. Yes, love the world so fiercely that your heart breaks open time and time again. But we don't get to stop there. Our Unitarian Universalism requires us to take that broken heart out into the world. It requires us to take some risks. Your love must join in with the love of others. You, each and every one of you, is needed in the movement. The movement that is working to dismantle structures of white supremacy, of racism, and oppression. Yes, you are needed in that effort. And it's by us coming together, not alone or individually, but as a collective group, as a voice that grows in intensity. That is how love does win, over and over. And we've seen in history that love indeed wins. And so I ask you this morning to pledge yourself anew to whatever values ground you, that you hang on to in times of tumult. And I ask you to pledge yourself anew to this faith that is indeed grounded in love and that is indeed calling you toward justice. And I ask you to pledge yourself anew this morning to a deep engagement with our world, hand in hand and heart to heart with the other souls in this room and in our larger community. It takes all of us doing our part. Love, once again, break our hearts open wide. Amen.